This is the second week that we're going to be uncomfortable. It was a little uncomfortable last week. Well, it's going to be a little uncomfortable this week too. Because the cross is not comfortable. We tend to sanitize the cross. You know, we put the cross on coffee mugs and on little pendants, and we just have it all over the place. But it would be really bizarre for people in the first century to see you walking around with a little cross and an ornament. It would be like today, I'm going to pass out, after the service, I'm passing out cups with electric chairs on them. How many of you would like a little gas chamber pendant to take home today? Or maybe a little firing squad fresco? Because the cross was the most horrible method of execution in that day. And so when people thought of the cross, they thought of something really terrible. Something that wasn't just painful, not just excruciatingly painful, but also very shameful. It was meant to degrade and humiliate. And that's what Jesus went through. You know, we sanitize the picture a little bit, but do you really think that the Romans, who wanted to be as brutal as possible and humiliate the people that they crucified as much as they possibly could, do you think they really got a little blanket to cover themselves up? I don't think so. You were hung up there naked and as vulnerable and shamed as possible. That's the way that it happened. And so when Jesus says, you have to take up, if you want to follow me, you have to take up your cross and follow me. In that original context, this is not a, all right, hey, I'm ready to go. This is not a, well, you know, you might have a little cross to bear. You know, you'll have a troublesome coworker. You'll have a difficult child. You know, you'll have terrible commuter traffic. You'll have a cross. Now, when Jesus said cross, he was talking about cross. He was talking about, as Elizabeth said, self-sacrifice, about giving it up, about giving ourselves up to be a blessing to others just like Jesus. Now, the thing is that most of us are never going to be in that situation. We're never going to be in the situation where we have to be completely selfless for the sake of our faith, for the sake of another person. It's just not going to happen. We don't live in a place where it's illegal to be a Christian. We don't live in a place where there's that kind of danger. But see, the thing is, for us to take up the cross, to live like Jesus lived, there's another story that kind of exemplifies this better for our context, which is Jesus washing his disciples' feet. Jesus was willing to do that kind of humble job. Jesus was willing to go to that length to show that he cared for his disciples. And we're invited to do the same thing. And just like Jesus was always encouraging people, encouraging the poor, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, we're encouraged to do those things too. That's part of taking up our cross, part of following in the steps of Jesus. And if we do those small things, the amazing thing is, if we love the person right in front of us, God expands our heart so that we'll be able to love more and more people. If we're generous to this one opportunity we have to give a little bit, God expands our hearts so that we can be more and more generous and have more and more impact. I was reading this week the story of two brothers in Tennessee, Alan and Eric Barnhart. They started a crane and rigging company, cranes and heavy equipment and stuff, and they decided that this wasn't going to be their company, but this was going to be God's company. So what they did is, even though they were the owners, they kind of polled the people in their adult Sunday school class, found out what the average income was, and said, that's how much we're going to make. We're not going to make anything more, and everything more that the company makes, we are going to give away. to help people in need, to help spread the gospel. We're just going to give it all away. And so the company prospered so much. For 23 years, it grew by an average of about 25% a year. So that it became huge, a $250 million company. And Alan and Eric went, no, it's not our money. We're just stewards, we're just managers for God. And they just kept on pouring out blessing into people's lives. And eventually they gave the whole company to a Christian foundation that could then, use this money all over the world. And they still work. They still work, they still do their jobs, they still do their best for the company. But it doesn't belong to them. Now, of course, they didn't just step into that, right? They didn't just say, well, this is where we're going to start. They learned generosity when they were kids. They watched their mom and dad share with people. They learned how to share as growing up. And then as they grew in wisdom, as they grew as people, as they grew in their faith, this is what they decided to do. An amazing thing. I'm sure you would agree with me. This is not standard. But to them, it's not really that much of a sacrifice. They are happy, fulfilled people. Some of the most joyful people that you would meet. Following along Jesus as best as they can. And so we can step up in ways like that. We can step up in ways of care, in ways of generosity, in ways of compassion. But the other thing that Jesus did, that maybe we don't think about so much, is that Jesus spoke up against injustice too. That's part of what's going on here. That Jesus is exposing the bankruptcy of the Roman Empire. He's exposing the brutality of the government. He's exposing the injustice that was so prevalent and saying, God is against this. And God will overcome this. That's what the resurrection said, that God will overcome it. And sometimes we too are called to speak out against the injustice. We're called to take the side of the people who are oppressed. We're called to speak and say that something is wrong. And I read a story this week. Some of you might remember the story of Ruby Bridges. Anybody remember the story of Ruby Bridges? All right, Mrs. Smith. So Ruby Bridges was one of the first African-American children to be integrated into the public schools in New Orleans in 1961. And there were 4 of these young girls, and every day they would get escorted by federal marshals into the school building, and there would be people lined up on either side yelling obscenities and death threats at them because those folk didn't want people like that in their school. And so Robert Coles, who was, and still is, I think, a psychologist at Harvard, went down to see how are these kids dealing with this? And so he's observing this, and one day he notices that as Ruby's going up the steps, she's talking. And later on he said, Ruby, well, what are you doing? Who are you talking to? What are you saying? And she says, I'm saying, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. She's praying for the people that are yelling obscenities at her. An amazing thing. An amazing thing. Another story of another one of those little girls, a girl named Tessie, she got to the point where she was just too tired. And she said to her grandmother, I can't do this anymore. I'm just too tired. You can't send me back to McDonough School. I can't do it. And her grandmother gives her some encouragement. She says, Tessie, I wish that I could go with you to school because I would call those people to my side. I would read to them from the Bible and I would tell them, I would remind them that God is up there, Jesus is up there, watching over all of us, and it doesn't matter who you are and it doesn't matter what color your skin is. She's telling this to her granddaughter and there's a bee that flies around in the kitchen. And so she gets the bee and tosses it outside. She doesn't kill it. She gets the bee outside. And she says to Tessie, Tessie, it's kind of like this. We work with the Lord to make the world into the place that the Lord wants it to be. Did you see that bee? That bee didn't belong in here. That bee belonged out there. So I got the bee and put it out there. And when we work with the Lord will help us make the world into a better place. And that's what we do. Because the Lord is with us. Powerful. Powerful stuff. We may never have the opportunity to speak so powerfully, but you may. You may. And you certainly will have the opportunity. You certainly will have the power to be a blessing. That when you take up your cross, when you look at the world through the eyes of Jesus, more, when Christ is in you, like Paul says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And that's true. That just as Christ lived in Paul, just as Christ lived in those first century Christians, Christ lives in you. That's the gift. So that when we have these opportunities, even though they might be hard, even though they might take some effort, it's something that we can do because we never do it alone. Thanks be to God.